He thought he was just lending his jacket to a shivering stranger, until she returned it days later with a house key and a note that read, "For the man who gave me warmth when I had none." Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind cut sharper than a knife as Jonah Hale locked the side door of Hale's auto and tire, the metal handle biting into his calloused fingers. The sun had long since dipped behind the hills that cradled Brook Hollow, leaving only the dull amber glow of the street lamp flickering over the frost-lined pavement. Snowflakes swirled in slow spirals, catching in the folds of his worn flannel and the edges of his wool cap. The day had been long. Oil changes, a busted transmission, and a no-show on a job that should have paid the electric bill. Still, Jonah didn't complain. He rarely did. Complaining didn't keep the heat on. He trudged across the icy lot toward his truck, boots crunching against the thin layer of snow. The quiet wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. Brook Hollow didn't make much noise at night, just the hum of old engines warming up in driveways and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. It was a town that didn't pretend to be more than it was. Jonah liked that. Simple was manageable, predictable. He was halfway into his truck when he heard it, the distant, uneven cough of an engine in trouble. He paused, hand on the door, ears tuned. Another sputter, then silence. He turned toward the sound, eyes squinting into the darkness beyond the street lamp's reach. And there it was, maybe a block away, hazard lights blinking faintly through the snowfall. A white car, sleek and unfamiliar, sat just off the shoulder of Main Street. It didn't belong here. Not just the make or model, but the feeling it gave off, like a ghost out of place. Jonah sighed, dropping his keys into his coat pocket and heading toward the car. It had been a long day. He was tired. But some things were muscle memory by now, like helping when help was needed. As he drew closer, he spotted her, standing beside the driver's side, arms wrapped tight around herself, coat thin and unzipped, hair pulled back in a low ponytail that was already damp from the snow. She looked lost in more ways than one. Her breath came out in quick, visible clouds. Jonah slowed, lifted a hand. "You all right?" She turned to him, startled, and for a second the world felt suddenly less cold. She stood like a statue beneath the falling snow, arms tucked tightly against her chest, breath fogging the air in front of her. From a distance, Jonah could see she was dressed all wrong for a night like this. Tailored slacks, sleek ankle boots, and a thin cream-colored coat that looked more suited for a city coffee shop than the shoulder of a rural road in winter. Her hair, dark and straight, clung to her cheeks where the snow had started to melt. The kind of woman who looked like she came from somewhere important, somewhere warm. As he got closer, she turned, startled. Up close, the fatigue in her face became clearer, eyes too wide from worry, lips tinged just a little blue from the cold. "Hey," Jonah said, keeping his voice calm and even, like he was talking to a spooked animal. "Didn't mean to scare you. Saw your lights flashing. Car trouble?" She hesitated before answering, her voice low and tight. "Yeah, it just stopped. I don't know what happened. I tried calling roadside, but my phone died." She held up the useless device, expression sheepish. Jonah nodded and glanced at the car. It was a high-end European model, one he'd only seen in magazines or at auto shows. Definitely not local. "Battery dead too?" She nodded. "I think so. I was hoping someone might drive by, but I've been out here for a while." Jonah shrugged out of his coat without thinking. "You're freezing. Here, take this." She opened her mouth to object, but he was already holding it out. His coat was old, quilt-lined, smelled faintly of pine and grease, and swallowed her whole when she finally slipped it on. But it was warm, and the relief in her posture was instant. "Thank you," she said, voice quieter now. "Name's Jonah," he offered. She hesitated again. "Ava?" "Well, Ava," he said, stepping toward the hood. "Mind if I take a look?" She shook her head. "Please." Jonah knelt by the front bumper, brushing snow off the grill. The world was quiet again, save for the steady beat of the hazard lights and the distant hush of falling snow. He didn't know who Ava was, or why a woman like her was stuck on a road like this, but something told him this wasn't just another repair call. The cold had a way of crawling under your skin in Brook Hollow. It didn't just sting, it lingered, settling deep into your bones and reminding you how far winter had sunk its claws into the town. Jonah had seen plenty of folks unprepared for it before, tourists passing through, new transplants who hadn't learned yet, but there was something different about the way Ava stood in the snow, too proud to admit she was freezing. She tried to hide it, kept her arms tight against her sides, rubbed her hands together as if the friction alone might save her. But Jonah could see her shivering, her fingers red at the tips, the kind of chill that meant her body had started to give in. He didn't think twice, just shrugged out of his heavy jacket and held it out. "Here," he said. "You'll catch your death out here in that thing." She looked at the coat like it was some kind of puzzle. "No, I'm fine, really." He raised an eyebrow. "You're not. That coat's for show, not for a night like this. Go on, take it." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. For a moment she looked ready to argue again, but then her shoulders slumped, and she reached out with hesitant fingers. The jacket dwarfed her frame as she slipped it on. The sleeves hung past her hands, and the shoulders sat broad on her, but she hugged it around herself like armor. She breathed in, and Jonah didn't miss the way her eyes fluttered shut for a brief second. Warmth. Maybe comfort, too. "Thank you," she said, voice softer than before. "You didn't have to." Jonah glanced at her, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Yeah, well, I've got more jackets. You've only got one you can't use." Ava smiled faintly, a real one this time, and Jonah turned back toward the car before it settled too long. The engine was still quiet, no sign of life. He popped the hood, steam curling out as he leaned in, already diagnosing possibilities. But even as he focused on the work, his mind wandered back to her, this stranger with city clothes, tired eyes, and a name that didn't belong in Brook Hollow. Something about her didn't make sense. And that, Jonah knew, was exactly why she'd end up staying in his thoughts longer than she should. The engine was dead and the battery was too. Jonah could tell after just a few minutes under the hood it wasn't going anywhere tonight. He closed it gently, letting the latch click into place as he turned to find Ava watching him, still wrapped tightly in his coat, her breath curling in the cold like smoke. "It's not starting tonight," he said simply. "Battery's drained and it's not charging. Could be the alternator, could be something deeper. Either way, you're not driving it in this weather." Ava didn't say anything for a second, just looked past him toward the dark road ahead, like she could will the car to work. Then she nodded once, like she'd expected this. "There's a little inn a few blocks from here," Jonah offered. "Not fancy, but they've got heat and they won't overcharge. I can give you a ride." "I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he replied. "Besides, standing out here hoping for a miracle's a lot more inconvenient." She looked like she might argue again, but instead she nodded. "Okay, thank you." The inside of Jonah's old pickup was warm, if a bit cluttered. A spare set of tools clinked in the footwell, and the scent of pine-scented air freshener fought with years of engine grease and leather. Ava settled into the passenger seat, folding her hands in her lap like she wasn't sure what to do with herself. Jonah started the truck, the engine rumbling to life. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the windshield wipers brushing snow aside with lazy persistence. Street lamps flickered past, lighting the road in brief golden flashes. Jonah glanced over at her once. She was staring out the window, jaw tight, a storm in her eyes she didn't seem ready to explain. "You from around here?" he asked finally. "No," she said, not looking at him. "Just passing through." He waited, but nothing followed. No mention of where she was headed, no why. "Visiting family?" he tried again. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "Something like that." Jonah didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some people carried their stories like locked suitcases, heavy, quiet, and not meant to be opened by strangers. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ava wasn't just running late. She was running, period. The morning sun crept over Brook Hollow like it was apologizing for showing up late, casting a pale light over the quiet town. Frost still clung to the windows of Jonah's truck as he parked in front of the Willow Pine Inn, the same place he'd dropped Ava off the night before. He hadn't planned to stop, but something, curiosity maybe, had tugged at him as he passed. Just wanted to check in, make sure she was all right. Maybe return her phone if she'd left it behind. That's what he told himself anyway. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of cinnamon and old carpet. A woman behind the counter looked up from her crossword with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," Jonah said, adjusting the brim of his cap. "Dropped someone off here last night. Ava, dark hair, thin coat. She checked in late, just wanted to see if she was still around." The woman blinked. "Sorry? What was the last name?" Jonah paused, then frowned. "Didn't catch it." "Well, we only had one guest check in last night," she said, flipping through a small ledger. "She paid in cash, no name given, checked out this morning before sunrise." Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. "She leave anything behind?" "Nope. Room was clean." The clerk tilted her head. "Friend of yours?" "Not exactly." He stepped back outside into the cold, the inn door clicking shut behind him. The truck stood waiting by the curb, steam rising faintly from the tailpipe. He opened the passenger door, half expecting to see his jacket folded neatly on the seat. It wasn't there. She'd taken it. He didn't know why that bothered him. Maybe it was because she'd left without a word. No thank you, no scribbled note, just vanished, like she'd never been there at all. But he remembered her, quiet, composed, tired in a way that ran deeper than lack of sleep. There had been something unfinished in her eyes. Jonah slid into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment staring out at the frozen street. He hadn't even known her full name, but somehow her absence felt like something had been taken from him. And he wasn't sure why that mattered so much. The bell above the garage door chimed as Jonah stepped into Hale's Auto and Tire, the familiar scent of oil, rubber, and coffee hitting him all at once. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and sank into your skin. An honest scent, one that reminded him of his father and long summers spent learning how to rebuild engines before he could even reach the pedals on a truck. Outside, the snow had turned to slush. Inside, the cold still crept through the drafty corners, making Jonah tug his flannel tighter around his shoulders. His jacket, the one he'd given to Ava, was still gone, and though he hadn't said a word about it, he'd felt its absence every time the wind slipped past his collar. He fired up the old space heater near the tool bench and grabbed a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. The first car of the day rolled in, a dented Camry with a rattling exhaust, and a customer who looked like they hadn't smiled in a decade. Jonah got to work without complaint. Mid-morning, the office door creaked open, and his younger brother Mason trudged in with his backpack slung low and a tired look on his face. "Bus broke down," Mason muttered. "Had to walk halfway." "Guess that makes 2 mechanics in the family now," Jonah said, nodding toward the wrench on the counter. Mason smirked faintly and sank into the worn chair near the desk. Jonah watched him out of the corner of his eye. 16, too smart for his own good and stubborn in all the worst ways. Their lives weren't glamorous, but they were trying. Jonah had taken care of Mason since their dad passed, and the garage wasn't just their livelihood, it was what was left of their roots. Invoices piled up beside the register. Parts orders were behind. A local client still hadn't paid for last month's brake job. Jonah scratched the back of his neck, took a deep breath, and kept going. The day passed like most others, noise, grease, and the hum of worn engines. But every now and then, between the clank of tools and the growl of machinery, Jonah's mind drifted back to a woman in a cream coat standing in the snow, gone without a name, still taking up space in his thoughts. It was the kind of quiet that only happened mid-afternoon, after the lunch rush, before the school buses came rumbling down Main Street. Jonah had just finished tightening the lug nuts on a pickup's rear tire when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the bay doors. Not a customer's usual beat-up sedan or rusty SUV. This was smooth, purposeful. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out to see a delivery van idling by the curb. A young guy in a Navy uniform stepped out, carrying a plain cardboard box, taped neatly at the seams. No logo, no return address. "Jonah Hale?" the courier asked. "Yeah? Got a delivery for you. Signature, please." Jonah scrawled his name and took the box, frowning as he turned it in his hands. No markings, no weight to it either. He set it down on the workbench inside and cut it open with his pocket knife, careful and slow. The top flaps folded back with a soft rustle, and there it was, his jacket. Clean, pressed, folded as if someone had taken their time with it. He stared at it for a second, caught off guard by the wave of familiarity. Then he reached in and lifted it out, noticing the weight in the inside pocket. He slid his hand in, fingers brushing metal. Out came a key, polished silver, modern cut, attached to a small brass tag that read Unit 3C. Beneath it, a piece of paper, thick, expensive stock, folded in thirds like a letter. He opened it. "Jonah, some things are easier to explain in writing. Thank you for the ride, the warmth, and not asking questions when I didn't have answers. I wasn't ready to tell you everything, but I left something for you. If you want to understand why, come find me. The address is below. You don't owe me anything, but I hope you'll come anyway. Ava." Below her name was an address in the next county over, not a neighborhood he recognized, too polished sounding, Gates Hill. Jonah stared at the letter, then down at the key resting in his palm. The metal felt warm, almost alive. For days he hadn't been able to shake her from his mind. Now she was inviting him into hers. The letter had weight, not in its size, but in its silence. Jonah sat alone in the office of the garage, the hum of the heater in the corner, the only sound breaking the stillness. The key lay on the desk beside his coffee mug, catching the pale winter light that streamed through the grimy window. The folded note sat open in front of him, his eyes scanning the last line again, slower this time, as if the words might change if he gave them enough time. "For the man who gave me warmth when I needed it most, come see what you've earned." He read it once more, mouth tightening around the edge of his thumb as he thought. The handwriting was careful, almost too neat, like someone who'd learned early in life that appearances mattered more than honesty. It fit her, poised, guarded, every word chosen like it had been weighed. But there was something else in it, too. Not just gratitude, invitation, challenge. He leaned back in the old desk chair, letting it creak beneath his weight. Across the room, Mason's backpack was slumped against the wall, a scuffed math book half sticking out. Jonah rubbed his eyes and let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest since Ava left. Who leaves a note like that? Who disappears and then sends a key with no explanation? More importantly, why him? He'd given her a coat, a ride, a conversation he barely understood the shape of, and now this cryptic letter, this clean key to a place that probably didn't belong in a town like Brook Hollow, and a sentence that wrapped itself around his ribs like a wire. "Come see what you've earned." Jonah wasn't a man who believed he'd earned much in life. He worked, he tried, he did what he could. But this felt like stepping into a story that wasn't meant for him, and still, part of him wanted to know. He folded the note again, slower this time. He didn't know what was waiting at that address in Gates Hill, but tomorrow he'd find out. The road out to Gates Hill curved like a question mark, winding past snow-dusted fields and old stone fences that had stood longer than Jonah had been alive. He knew these outskirts well, or at least he thought he did. Brook Hollow didn't have much in the way of secrets, but as he passed a wrought iron gate flanked by towering pines and turned down a long, narrow drive, Jonah realized there were still places in his hometown that didn't show up on the map. At the end of the drive stood a house, or more accurately, an estate. Massive, still, silent. The kind of house that didn't just belong to money, it belonged to legacy. Tall windows glinted in the weak afternoon sun, and the front porch stretched wide like it was daring someone to cross it. The driveway had been cleared, the stone path salted. Someone had been expecting him. Jonah parked his truck near the circular roundabout and stepped out into the cold. The mansion loomed above him, all clean lines and manicured stone. It looked like it had been plucked from some glossy magazine and dropped right onto Brook Hollow soil, where it sat too quiet and too perfect, like it knew it didn't belong. He took the steps slowly, boots thudding against the polished wood. Before he could even knock, the door opened. A man in a dark sweater and slacks greeted him with a nod. Not a butler, too casual for that, but definitely not just a friend. "Mr. Hale?" the man asked, polite but unreadable. "Yeah," Jonah said, shifting his weight. "Is Ava here?" "She's expecting you this way." Jonah followed him through the entryway, where warmth and quiet wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. Hardwood floors gleamed under his boots. Paintings he didn't recognize hung on the walls, all soft golds and deep blues. It smelled like cedar and something faintly floral. The man led him down a hallway and stopped in front of a set of double doors. "She's inside." Then he stepped away, leaving Jonah alone. Jonah hesitated, hand on the door, heart ticking just a little faster. He wasn't sure what he expected to find behind those doors, but whatever it wasn't going to be simple. Nothing about Ava Langford had been. The doors opened with a soft groan, and Jonah stepped into a room that felt more like a museum than a place someone actually lived. High ceilings arched overhead with exposed beams that framed the space like a cathedral. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a frozen lake in the distance, the sunlight catching on the ice like scattered glass. In the center of the room, framed by elegance and silence, stood Ava Langford. She was no longer the woman shivering in the snow beside a broken-down car. Her posture was straight, composed. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, and she wore a tailored navy sweater and black slacks that looked as expensive as they were effortless. There was a different kind of cold here, quiet, curated, the chill of a life spent behind gates and glass. But her eyes, those hadn't changed. Jonah stood still, uncertain of how to close the space between them. "So," he said after a moment, his voice rougher than he meant it to be, "you're not just passing through." Ava smiled faintly. "Not exactly." "You live here?" "I own here," she replied, stepping toward him slowly. "But I don't live anywhere, really. Not for long." Jonah looked around the room again, polished, expensive, immaculate, and tried to imagine her curled up with a blanket and a book, or even just cooking breakfast. It didn't fit. "You run Langford Automotive," he said, more of a statement than a question. "I am Langford Automotive." Her voice was calm, measured. "CEO, 4th generation. Started working on engines before I had my driver's permit." Jonah let out a breath and gave a short nod. "Well, that explains the car." She tilted her head, something soft flickering behind her guarded gaze. "It explains more than that." They stood in silence for a moment, two people from opposite sides of a world neither fully understood. Then she stepped closer, voice quieter now. "When you gave me your coat, you didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything, you just helped me." Her eyes didn't waver. "People don't do that for me. Not without a price." Jonah crossed his arms, brows low. "Wasn't trying to earn anything." "I know," she said. "That's why you did." And for the first time since she disappeared, Jonah understood. He wasn't here because of who she was. He was here because of who he'd been, in the moment that mattered. Jonah wasn't the kind of man who needed explanations. He'd lived most of his life without them, without answers, without closure, without anyone telling him why. But standing there in that impossibly pristine room, surrounded by the kind of silence only money could buy, he realized he wanted one. Not out of curiosity, out of something deeper, something he didn't quite know how to name. Ava moved to the window, her fingers lightly brushing the cold glass as she stared out toward the frozen lake. Her reflection hovered faintly beside her, distant and still. "That night," she began, "I wasn't supposed to be in Brook Hollow. I wasn't supposed to be driving at all. My assistant had a car waiting to take me to a dinner in Chicago, a room full of investors and men twice my age who smile when I walk in and plot behind my back when I leave." She paused, arms folding across her chest. "I walked away from it. From all of it. No plan, no destination. I just drove." Jonah watched her carefully. She wasn't performing. Not now. Her voice was stripped of the polish, the precision. She was just a woman with tired eyes and too much weight on her shoulders. "I was raised to run a company," she continued. "Not a family, not a life, just a brand. Expectations, decisions, rules. Always composed, always one step ahead. But that night, I broke. I couldn't breathe inside it anymore." She turned to him then, and her gaze was steady. "I didn't expect to break down, not in your town, not in front of you." Jonah shifted, but said nothing. He could feel the rawness in her words. They weren't rehearsed. "You didn't know me. You didn't care about what I owned or what name was on the title of the car. You saw someone cold and tired, and you helped her." She stepped closer. "You gave me your coat. You gave me safety without knowing a thing about me. That doesn't happen in my world." Jonah met her eyes, something quiet settling between them. "You asked why you?" Ava said softly. "Because you were the first real thing I'd felt in a long time." And Jonah, who'd always thought of himself as just a man trying to make it to the next day, stood there stunned, because in one broken-down moment, without meaning to, he'd changed someone's course completely. Jonah shifted his weight, crossing his arms as if bracing himself for a punch he hadn't seen coming. Ava stood across from him now, no longer near the window, but square in the center of the room, grounded, deliberate. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and there was something in her eyes, firm, almost businesslike, that put him on edge. "I want to help," she said. He blinked. "Help? With your garage." Jonah let out a small, disbelieving laugh, more reflex than humor. "You want to, what, write me a check?" She didn't flinch. "Not a check, a partnership, an investment. I've looked into Hale's Auto and Tire, small operation, long history, deep local roots, and I know a struggling business when I see one." That last part hit harder than she probably intended. Jonah felt his jaw tighten. "So what?" he said slowly. "You looked me up." "I did," Ava admitted. "After I left. I wanted to know more about the man who gave a stranger his jacket and didn't ask for anything in return." Jonah looked away, a low frustration stirring beneath his ribs. He'd spent the last few years fighting tooth and nail just to keep the garage afloat, fixing things with borrowed tools and overdue parts, keeping his brother in school, the lights on, the heat running. He'd done it without handouts, without shortcuts. Now here she was, offering everything he'd never had, wrapped up in business smooth words and perfect posture. "Why would you do that?" he asked, voice flat. "You don't owe me anything." Ava stepped closer. "It's not about owing. It's about value. You're the kind of man I would have overlooked 5 years ago, 10 maybe, but not anymore." He studied her face, looking for the catch, the angle, anything that made this feel less impossible. "You really think pouring money into a broke garage in a one-stoplight town is a good investment?" She smiled faintly. "Not for everyone, but for me, it might be the best one I've ever made." Jonah didn't answer. He couldn't, because part of him wanted to say yes. The other part still didn't trust a world that gave so much, so fast, without warning. Jonah's hands curled into fists at his sides, the silence in the room stretching long and tight, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of things unsaid, things uninvited. He took a step back, needing space that the cavernous room couldn't give. "I can't take your money," he said, the words clipped. "I won't." Ava tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Why not?" "Because I didn't help you to get something out of it, and I'm not about to let someone come in and slap a shiny label on my family's garage like it's a pet project." She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just looked at him in that way she had. Quiet, composed, but with an edge of steel under it. "You think that's what this is?" "I think people with your kind of money don't do anything without a return." A beat passed. Then she stepped forward, slow and measured. "You're right. I don't." She paused. "But not everything that returns value shows up in a ledger, Jonah." He met her eyes, jaw tight. "Langford Automotive is a billion-dollar empire. You don't need my little shop." "No," she said, "but maybe I need what it stands for." That caught him off guard. "My family built cars," she continued, voice softer now. "But along the way, we lost the heart of it, the honesty, the grease-under-your-nails kind of work that makes people believe in machines and the people who fix them." Jonah looked away, the lump in his throat tightening. She didn't know how many nights he'd stayed up balancing overdue invoices, how many meals he'd skipped so Mason could eat better. The garage wasn't just a business. It was survival, legacy, and pride. "You say it's not charity," he muttered. "But it feels like it." "It's not," she said. "Charity is for people who've given up. You haven't. This is investment in someone good, in something worth keeping alive." He wanted to believe her, but belief came slow for a man who'd had to do everything the hard way. So he shook his head, voice quiet but certain. "Thanks, but I built this place with my own 2 hands. If I'm going to keep it alive, it's going to be mine that does it." Ava didn't argue. She just nodded once. And somehow, that made walking away harder. The next morning, the cold bit a little less as Jonah pulled into the estate's driveway, his old truck looking like it had wandered onto the wrong movie set. The mansion rose up from the snow like something out of a dream, still too big, too perfect, but this time it didn't feel quite so foreign. Maybe because he wasn't there as a guest anymore. He was there to work. The garage behind the house was a structure all its own. Glass-paneled doors, radiant heating, polished concrete floors. It looked more like an art gallery than a place to turn a wrench. Inside, under soft lighting and surgical cleanliness, sat a lineup of vintage cars so rare and pristine they might as well have been ghosts. A '69 Mustang Fastback, a cherry-red Jaguar E-Type, a deep green Aston Martin with curves that could quiet a room. Jonah let out a low whistle. "These yours?" Ava stood beside the Aston, her hands tucked into the pockets of a long coat. "Inherited some, found the others. I collect what my father called unnecessary." "So," he gave a short chuckle. "Most folks in town collect bottle caps or expired coupons." She smiled, then nodded toward the workbench, stocked with tools still gleaming from lack of use. "I want them running, properly, not just polished up for show." Jonah's brow arched. "You sure you want me doing this? I'm not exactly certified for this kind of elegance." "I don't want elegance," she said. "I want someone who won't fake it, someone who knows the difference between fixing and covering up." He watched her for a beat, still half expecting a catch to fall from the rafters. "And the garage?" he asked. "I'll back it, quietly. As a partner, not an owner. No billboards, no press, no headlines. You run it like you always have." He rubbed the back of his neck. "So I fix your museum pieces, and you give my place a fighting chance." She nodded. "That's the deal. No strings." Jonah glanced around the space, at the cars, the tools, the quiet confidence in her voice, and nodded. "All right, let's do it." What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this deal wasn't just about engines and old steel. It was about everything that lay between two people who weren't supposed to collide, but already had. By the second week, Jonah knew every car in Ava's garage by heart. He knew the sound of the Jaguar's temperamental ignition, the weight of the Aston's hood, and the way the Mustang smelled faintly of old gasoline and leather dreams. He arrived early each day, sometimes before the frost had even melted from the trees, and left late, hands black with grease, mind heavy with thoughts he didn't know how to name. The work was honest, the place anything but. The space was too clean, too quiet. Tools hung in perfect order, wrenches polished like silverware. At first Jonah had found it sterile. Now it just felt like hers. Every car told a story, and Ava, she was always nearby, watching. Sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes with silence. Always dressed like she didn't belong in a garage, and somehow made it feel like she did. They talked more now, nothing deep, at least not at first. She asked about engines, about torque and compression ratios. He asked where she'd learned to drive stick. They argued about carburetors and laughed about the fact she could dismantle a gearbox diagram but couldn't change a flat tire without cursing in 3 languages. The rhythm between them was slow, steady, unspoken, like a song they both knew but hadn't realized they'd been humming together. Still, something lingered beneath it all, something taut. Jonah felt it every time their hands brushed over the same tool or when she leaned too close while examining a restored engine. He felt it in the quiet pauses, in the glances that lasted a second too long. She was elegance and restraint. He was grit and calloused hands. They had no business standing in the same room, let alone building something between oil spills and engine blocks. And yet they were. One afternoon she brought lunch, real sandwiches from a bakery across town, 2 cans of ginger ale, and a smile that reached her eyes. They sat on the edge of the workbench, boots tapping in time on the floor, the '69 Mustang gleaming beside them. "You ever think," she said, picking at the crust of her bread, "how weird this is?" Jonah looked over, brow raised. "What? That you're eating deli food in a multi-million-dollar garage?" She laughed. "That I'm here, with you, and it feels normal." He didn't answer, because it did. And that, more than anything, was the part that scared him. It started with a missing socket wrench. Jonah had been elbow-deep in the undercarriage of a '63 Corvette, one hand balancing a light, the other reaching blindly for the toolbox he was sure he'd left just within arm's reach. When he stood and turned to grab it, the wrench was gone, probably rolled off the bench. He knelt, scanning the floor, and noticed a slim, almost invisible seam in the far wall near the back of the garage, like a door, but without a handle. Curious, he followed the trail of the missing tool. The seam led to a narrow corridor tucked behind a tall cabinet. The cabinet didn't quite reach the wall. A draft filtered through the space between. Jonah eased around it and found a small recessed latch nearly hidden in the woodwork. He pressed it. The wall clicked open with a soft, mechanical sigh. A steep staircase disappeared into the darkness below, the smell of dust and cedar rising like a forgotten breath. Jonah paused. Something about it felt untouched, cold, but curiosity outweighed caution. He grabbed a flashlight from the bench and began descending. The cellar was nothing like the rest of the house. No polished floors, no pristine order, just stone walls, a low ceiling, and silence thick as smoke. A few boxes lined the shelves, some labeled, some not. Old car parts, photo albums, a cracked leather suitcase. Then he saw them. Frames leaned against the far wall, not displayed, hidden. He knelt and turned one over. It was a photograph. A much younger Ava standing beside a man who looked too stern to be smiling but was trying anyway. Her father, maybe, or someone worse. Jonah didn't recognize him, but Ava's eyes in the picture weren't the same ones she wore now. They were heavier. "Jonah?" He turned fast, startled. Ava stood at the top of the stairs, her voice too even to be casual, her expression unreadable. "I was looking for a wrench," he said, holding up the flashlight. "Found this instead." She descended only halfway, keeping her distance. "That room's not part of the tour." "Didn't mean to pry. I know." A pause stretched between them. "That place," she said quietly, "is full of things I don't need to remember." He studied her for a long moment but didn't push. Her tone wasn't angry, just final. Some wounds, he realized, didn't bleed on the outside, and some doors stayed closed for a reason. He backed away and let her seal the cellar behind him, but the weight of it stayed with him all the same. The invitation came on a Tuesday, tucked between a new carburetor shipment and a half-eaten granola bar on Jonah's workbench. Thick cardstock, dark navy, with embossed gold lettering, classy in a way that made Jonah immediately suspicious. He picked it up with grease-stained fingers, squinting at the sharp script. Langford Foundation Winter Gala, Saturday 7 p.m. Black tie required. He stared at it like it was written in another language. It might as well have been. Later that day, Ava strolled into the garage like she always did. Coat half-buttoned, sleeves pushed up, coffee in hand. Jonah held up the invitation between two fingers. "What's this?" She took a sip, unfazed. "A night out, with me." "I'm not a tux guy, Ava." "That's all right. I already had one rented in your size." She smiled sweetly, as if that settled the matter. Jonah shook his head, setting the invite back on the bench. "I don't belong at things like that." "You belong where I ask you to be," she said gently, "and I'm asking." He met her eyes the way he always did when he needed to decide whether she was serious or just trying to win. This time, it wasn't either. It was something else, something quieter. She wasn't demanding, she was hoping. "Why?" he asked, softer now. Ava stepped closer, leaning her hip against the bench. "Because I've spent years in rooms full of polished people saying polished things. Not one of them ever meant more to me than the man who fixed my car without asking for a thing." Her voice dipped, almost cautious. "This gala isn't about investors. It's about showing people who I am now. You're part of that." Jonah looked down, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. Part of him still wanted to say no, to keep the line between her world and his sharp and clear. But another part, the part that remembered the note in the jacket pocket, the lunches in the garage, the way she looked at him like he was something solid, knew the truth. He mattered to her, not just in the shadows, but in the light. So he exhaled slowly, glancing at her sidelong. "Black tie, huh?" Her smile returned, warm and wide. "Don't worry, you clean up just fine." Jonah hadn't worn a suit since his father's funeral, and even then it didn't fit right. The tux felt foreign, stiff in the shoulders, tight at the collar, like it was borrowed from a version of himself he didn't recognize. The mirror at the hotel showed him someone sharper, quieter and cleaner than he was used to seeing. Hair slicked back, jaw freshly shaved, the old grease under his nails scrubbed away until his hands looked like they belonged to someone else. Almost. He adjusted the tie again and muttered under his breath, "Ridiculous." But then the town disappeared behind him as he pulled up to the Langford Foundation's Winter Gala. The venue was a marble and glass monument to old money and new power, its entrance glowing with soft gold light and flanked by two valets who looked like they were too scared to breathe on the guests' cars. Jonah's beat-up truck had been left at the hotel. Ava had sent a driver. Inside, everything sparkled. Chandelier light bounced off crystal glasses and sequined gowns. Waiters moved like ghosts with silver trays, and the air smelled faintly of money and something floral Jonah couldn't name. People didn't talk so much as they murmured, low, knowing tones that said more than their words ever could. Then he saw her. Ava stood near the grand staircase in a backless black dress that shimmered like moonlight on a lake. Elegant, effortless. But when her eyes found Jonah, her whole face softened. Not for the cameras, not for the room, for him. She crossed the floor and took his hand without hesitation. "You made it." "I don't think I had a choice," he said, trying not to gape. She laughed and turned toward the crowd, still holding on to him. "Everyone," she said to a nearby cluster of polished suits and pearl necklaces, "this is Jonah Hale, my partner." The word landed like a stone dropped in a still pond. Eyebrows arched, smiles froze in place. One man, a broad-shouldered guy with perfect hair and something smug in his posture, tilted his head and gave Jonah a once-over that bordered on condescending. "Langford's finally shaking things up," he said dryly. Jonah held his gaze. "Just fixing what's broken." The man raised an eyebrow, but Ava smiled, proud and unbothered. Jonah wasn't used to this kind of room, but in that moment, with Ava beside him and every eye watching, he realized something strange. He wasn't just surviving it. He belonged there, whether they liked it or not. The ballroom shimmered with noise, chatter layered over music, clinking glasses, laughter that never reached the eyes. Jonah had stepped away from the main floor to breathe, finding his way toward the far end of the gallery wing, where framed photos of past Langford Foundation events lined the walls. He wasn't built for crowds, let alone rooms where every conversation was a transaction in disguise. He sipped from a glass of something too expensive to taste good and wandered past a velvet curtain half drawn over a small, sitting alcove. That's when he heard it. Ava's voice, low, firm, familiar, but sharper now. "All business. You're not listening, and I'm not interested." A man's voice followed, smooth as smoke, but tight with warning. "You're walking away from something that built you." "I didn't build Langford just to hand it over to vultures," Ava shot back, "especially not with you backing the deal." Jonah moved closer, careful not to be seen, heart beginning to thrum. "You don't have the leverage you think you do," the man said. "That small-town charity act might impress the board, but it won't hold up in a merger. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm trying to change things." The man let out a low chuckle, like he'd heard something amusing. "You think dragging some grease-stained mechanic into a ballroom makes you credible? Come on, Ava. You're playing dress-up with someone who can't even spell acquisition." Jonah stiffened, every instinct in him telling him to step in, but he didn't. Not yet. There was a pause, then Ava's voice dropped, ice in her words now. "Leave Jonah out of this. He's more honest than any man in this room, and that includes you, Dad." Jonah felt the floor shift under him. Her father. He hadn't seen the man's face yet, but now he had a name, a relationship, and a truth that felt heavier than anything he'd come to the gala expecting. "You walk away from this deal," her father said, "and you walk away from everything we built. Don't expect a safety net when you fall." "I never had one," she replied, "but I'd rather fall on my own than sell what's left of my soul." Silence followed. Jonah backed away quietly, the shadows swallowing him whole. He hadn't meant to hear it, but now he couldn't unhear any of it, and he knew. Ava wasn't just fighting for change. She was fighting to be free. The fireworks cracked overhead like distant thunder, lighting the sky in bursts of gold and white. From the balcony just off the west wing of the estate, the noise was softer, the world quieter. A few stragglers had wandered outside with champagne flutes and polite smiles, but Jonah stood alone near the stone railing, his tie loosened, the night air sharp against his collar. He heard the door open behind him. Ava stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the marble before she slipped them off entirely and padded across the cold stone barefoot. She stopped beside him, the hem of her dress swaying gently in the breeze. "You disappeared," she said, not accusing, just stating a truth. "I needed air," Jonah replied. "Too many forks with 3 tines in that room." Ava let out a tired laugh, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. They always make everything look prettier than it feels. Jonah glanced sideways. "You all right?" She didn't answer right away, just leaned her forearms on the railing, staring out at the horizon, where the last of the fireworks faded into smoke. The silence between them was thick, but not heavy. It waited patiently. "My mother hated nights like this," she said finally. "All the lights and music and people pretending they liked each other. She used to take me out to the lake, sit in the dark, and tell me the truth about things. Not the version the world wanted, the hard version." Jonah nodded, letting her speak. "My father only cared about what looked good, what could be leveraged. I was part of the Langford portfolio before I could walk." She paused, her fingers tracing a line along the stone. I spent so many years thinking if I could just be the best, at business, at leadership, at everything, then maybe I'd feel full. She looked up at the stars, her eyes shining, not from tears but from honesty. But I don't. I never have. Not with the money, not with the power, not with the name. Jonah swallowed, the ache in her words settling in his chest. What about now? He asked. She looked at him, and for a moment the polished CEO disappeared. Just a woman, barefoot on a balcony, telling the truth. I'm starting to think peace doesn't come from what you build, she whispered. It comes from who you let in. And in that quiet space beneath the stars, Jonah didn't need to say anything back. He was already there. The silence between them wasn't empty. It pulsed with everything unsaid. Jonah stood just inches from Ava now, the sounds of the party behind them fading into a quiet hum. Her gaze lingered on his, unguarded, and for the first time since they'd met on that snowy roadside, there were no walls between them. Just breath. Just closeness. The stars hung low above the balcony, as if holding their breath too. Ava's hair had come loose in the breeze, soft strands brushing against her cheek. Jonah reached up slow and uncertain, tucking one behind her ear. His fingers grazed her skin, warm, impossibly soft. She didn't flinch. If anything, she leaned into the touch, just slightly. I don't think I'm supposed to feel this way, she murmured. Me neither, Jonah replied, voice low. His hand lingered by her cheek. Her eyes dropped to his mouth. Time stopped moving. He leaned in, closer. The air shifted. Her lips parted, waiting, maybe inviting. The space between them disappeared into something fragile and electric. Then his phone buzzed, loud, jarring. Jonah froze, hand dropping instinctively to his pocket. Ava blinked, the moment rupturing like glass. Sorry, he muttered, stepping back as reality flooded in. He glanced at the screen. Mason, his stomach sank. Give me a second, he said, answering as he walked toward the far end of the balcony. Mason? What's going on? A rush of words met him on the other end. His brother's voice was tight, a little panicked. He'd missed the bus after a tutoring session. His phone had died. He was stuck in the next town over. The shop teacher had just left, and no one else had picked up. Jonah sighed, pressing a hand to his forehead. All right, I'm coming. He ended the call and turned back toward Ava, who was now standing with her arms crossed, eyes downcast. The spell between them had broken, and the cold had crept back in. Everything okay? She asked. He nodded reluctantly. It's Mason. He needs a ride. Of course it was Mason. His life didn't come with elegant balconies and perfect timing, just responsibility, always. Ava gave a small smile, the kind that tried not to be disappointed. Go. He's family. Jonah hesitated for a moment, then nodded and turned to leave. But as he stepped inside, one thought lingered like a bruise just beneath the surface. They had been one heartbeat away from something real, and real didn't wait forever. The morning sun hadn't even climbed above the trees when Jonah pulled into the gravel lot of Hale's Auto and Tire. He was running on 3 hours of sleep, a lukewarm coffee, and the kind of exhaustion that settled behind your eyes and refused to leave. After dropping Mason off at school, he'd hoped for a quiet day, routine, predictable. But the garage didn't look quiet. The front bay door was half open, the steel slats twisted like someone had tried to pry it up with brute force. Shattered glass glittered across the entryway like morning frost. The side window, where he usually posted parts lists and local flyers, was smashed in, jagged at the edges. Jonah slammed the truck door and ran up the steps. The office was trashed. Drawers yanked out and dumped on the floor, papers scattered, some soaked through from a busted water line. The old cash register had been knocked over, the drawer pried open, even though Jonah hadn't kept more than $20 in it since the Carter job 6 months ago. Tools were gone, some of the more expensive diagnostic gear too, but that wasn't what made his stomach turn. It was the wall by the workbench, spray-painted in harsh black letters, right across the faded photo of his dad, and him rebuilding their first engine together, were 4 words: "She's not for you." Jonah stood frozen, fists clenched at his sides, heart pounding like a hammer inside his chest. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a break-in. This was a message. He backed out of the office slowly, stepping over broken glass and splintered wood. The air smelled like oil, rust, and warning. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to steal tools. They'd wanted to make sure Jonah felt it, felt small, felt watched, felt out of place in a world that didn't want him stepping foot outside of Brook Hollow, let alone into the life of someone like Ava Langford. He exhaled through his nose, sharp and angry, then pulled out his phone. Not the cops, not Mason, Ava. And for the first time since he'd met her, he didn't know what to say. Ava arrived within the hour. Her sleek black SUV rolled to a stop just outside the garage, tires crunching over broken glass as she stepped out, a dark coat wrapped tightly around her, hair pulled back, eyes sharper than Jonah had ever seen them. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch at the mess or the vandalism or the stinging words still scrawled across the wall. She walked straight toward him, her heels echoing in the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low but tight with urgency. "I'm fine," Jonah muttered, though his jaw was clenched and his hands wouldn't stop flexing at his sides. "Garage isn't." She scanned the damage quickly, her brows narrowing. "Do you know who did it?" "No names," Jonah said, but the message was pretty clear. Ava turned to the wall, her face unreadable. "She's not for you." It stared back at them, bold and crude. She inhaled slowly, then looked at him. "This is because of me." He didn't say anything, but the answer was already in the air. Ava took out her phone. "I'll have a crew here in an hour. They'll clean this up, replace what's missing. I'll cover everything." "No," Jonah said sharply. She paused. "Jonah?" "I said no." His voice was firmer than he meant it to be, but the heat in his chest wouldn't let him soften it. "I appreciate it, really. But this place, this is mine. My mess. My name on the door." "No!" "I'm not trying to take that away from you," she said carefully. "I know you're not. But if I let you fix this, I lose something I can't get back." She stepped closer, quieting. "This isn't charity. It's care." Jonah met her eyes, something fierce and tired behind his own. "I've spent my whole life making sure no one could say I needed saving. Not when my dad died, not when the bills piled up, not even when I was scraping by with Mason and 2 broken lifts. I won't start now." They stood there in the cold silence of the ruined garage, 2 people who wanted to give but didn't know how to receive. "I don't want your money," he said finally. "I want to stand on my own 2 feet. With you, maybe, but still on my own." Ava nodded slowly. The fire in her eyes didn't dim, but she stepped back, giving him the space he needed, even if it made her ache to do it. And Jonah turned toward the mess, sleeves rolled heart heavy. He didn't want her to fix it. He needed to fix it for himself. The next few days passed like winter wind, sharp, cold, impossible to ignore. Jonah buried himself in repairs, fixing what he could with what little he had left. Insurance was slow, the police were slower, and the silence between him and Ava, that was the loudest thing of all. She'd stopped coming by. He hadn't called. There wasn't a fight. Not really. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just something slow unraveling between them, thread by quiet thread. It wasn't about the garage anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about pride. About fear, about 2 people standing on different ground, looking at the same thing, and seeing it through entirely different eyes. On the 4th evening, after closing up the shop and locking the new deadbolt he'd installed himself, Jonah drove out toward the edge of town. The mansion loomed in the distance, glowing faintly behind tall trees and taller fences. He hadn't been back since the day of the break-in. He told himself he was just returning a set of tools he'd borrowed. But when he pulled into the long driveway, engine idling low, he knew better. Ava met him at the door before he even knocked. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," she said quietly. Jonah handed her the tool bag. Didn't want to leave things unfinished. She took it, nodding. Her expression was calm, but her eyes flickered, like she was waiting for something more. "Look," Jonah said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been thinking about all this, the deal, the cars, us." A pause hung between them. "I can't do it," he said finally. "Not like this. I thought I could walk the line, keep my life mine, while being part of yours, but I can't." Ava's voice was barely a whisper. "So you're leaving?" "I'm stepping back," he said. "From the deal, from the partnership. I've got to figure out who I am without someone else's resources propping me up. If I don't, I'll never know if I'm standing on my own or just on borrowed ground." She looked at him, eyes shimmering but steady. "And me?" He hesitated. That answer hurt more than the others. "I don't know," he said. "Right now, I just don't know." He turned before he could change his mind, walked down the steps without looking back. The night air bit hard against his collar, but he didn't feel it, because some goodbyes don't slam shut. They just close softly, like a door left unlocked. Winter returned with a quiet vengeance, sheets of gray cloud rolling in over Brook Hollow, the wind slicing through town like it had unfinished business. Snow piled along the sidewalks again, soft and cold and constant. Everything slowed down, except the rumors. Ava Langford was gone. No official word, no press release, just vanished. Some folks said she'd gone back to Chicago. Others swore they saw her boarding a private jet 2 towns over. A few guessed the break-in at Hale's had spooked her off, convinced her small-town life wasn't worth the trouble. The gossip moved faster than the snowplows. Jonah didn't say a word. He worked longer hours now, even when the garage was quiet, fixed things that didn't need fixing, cleaned parts that were already clean. Mason noticed, but didn't push. They'd both learned to let silence sit where it needed to. Still, every now and then, Mason would glance at the empty spot where Ava used to park her SUV and then back at Jonah, like he wanted to ask something but didn't. She hadn't called. He hadn't either. He told himself it was for the best, that walking away had been the right thing to do, that if he missed her, it was only because she'd disrupted the rhythm he'd spent years building. He'd gotten by before her. He'd get by after. But the nights felt colder now. He'd reach for a tool and expect to hear her voice behind him. He'd open the garage in the morning and glance at the road, half hoping to see a sleek car pulling in. He'd lie awake some nights, remembering the way she looked on the balcony, barefoot and honest, talking about peace like it was something you had to earn. And every time the door creaked open, he looked up just a little too fast, only to see a customer or Mason or no one at all. Ava was gone, but she hadn't left the town empty. She'd left it echoing. It arrived on a Wednesday, no return address. Just Jonah's name, written in careful script across the top of a plain brown box, the kind that looked like it had been handled gently all the way to Brook Hollow. It sat on the front steps of the garage, waiting in the snow like it belonged there, like it had always been meant to find him. He brought it inside without a word, brushed the flakes from the top, and set it down on the workbench. For a long moment he just stared at it. The flaps weren't taped, just folded neatly, almost like an invitation more than a delivery. He opened it. Inside was a stack of items wrapped in a soft blue scarf. Her scarf, the one she'd worn the night they watched the fireworks from the balcony. On top, a handwritten letter, pages of it folded and tucked beneath the corner of the cloth. He unfolded it slowly. The ink was smooth, the lines deliberate. "Jonah, I didn't know how else to do this. Words come easier when I don't have to see your face, because if I saw you, I'm not sure I'd be brave enough to say all of this. I left because I had to, not because I wanted to. What you said that night, about standing on your own, I heard you. I respected it. But I also needed to do the same, not as a CEO, not as someone with power or family ties or influence, just as Ava, the woman I lost somewhere along the way. So I left everything behind, the board, the headlines, the investors. I sold my shares. I walked away. Not because of weakness, but because for the first time I saw what life looked like outside the glass walls. I saw it in you." He stopped reading for a moment, breath caught in his chest. Beneath the letter were photographs, childhood snapshots of Ava with a tired-looking mother and a stern-suited father. Newspaper clippings followed, business deals, charity events, interviews that quoted her but never really heard her. And finally, more recent pictures, ones he hadn't seen before. Her by the lake, her in the garage, sleeves rolled, grease smudged across her wrist. Someone must have taken them quietly, in between work and silence and something like peace. She had given him her story, not the polished version, the real one. And as Jonah sat there, letter trembling slightly in his hands, he realized something simple and staggering. She had left. But she hadn't let go. The letter stayed on the workbench for a long time after Jonah finished reading it. He didn't fold it, didn't pack it back into the box. He just let it lie there, the paper curled slightly at the edges, as if the words were still breathing. Snow fell steadily outside the garage windows, blanketing the town in the kind of hush that made everything feel slower, closer. He sat on the old stool near the tool rack, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. For days he'd told himself Ava's disappearance was just another chapter closing, that she'd moved on like people from her world always did, that what they'd shared, those quiet, electric moments between engine grease and elegance, was never meant to last. But now he knew better. The photographs, the clippings, the scarf, the letter, they weren't just memories. They were her way of saying, "I want you to see me, all of me, not just the parts that are easy to love." Jonah had spent most of his life building walls out of necessity, out of survival. But Ava hadn't asked him to tear them down. She'd simply walked up to them, placed her story at the base, and waited. Not to impress him, not to fix him, but to meet him exactly where he was. And suddenly, everything he'd held onto so tightly, his pride, his independence, his fear of being swallowed up by a world he didn't understand, felt small compared to what she'd been offering all along. Not charity, not control, belonging. Not the kind that came with contracts or shared assets, but the kind that whispered, "This life could be yours too, if you want it." He exhaled slow and steady, the weight in his chest shifting into something quieter, lighter. Ava hadn't asked him to come find her, but in every word, every photo, every folded page of that letter, she had left the door open. And for the first time since she'd disappeared, Jonah knew exactly what he needed to do. Not because he owed her, because he finally understood what mattered most. Her, them, home. The road stretched out before him like a ribbon of possibility, flanked by bare trees and frozen fields that shimmered beneath the winter sun. Jonah's old truck rattled over patches of salted asphalt, the heater fighting to keep the cab warm, the tires humming with purpose. The letter was folded on the passenger seat, worn from the number of times he'd picked it up, read it, held it, like a compass. He didn't know exactly where Ava had gone. The return address on the package was a dead end, just a postal center in the next county, but she had left clues. A lake in upstate New York where her mother used to take her. A cabin her family had abandoned long ago, but she remembered like it was yesterday. He'd circled the mention in her letter 3 times before grabbing his keys. He wasn't chasing her to get answers. He was chasing her because he already had them. The miles peeled away, town by town, until Brook Hollow was a fading memory in the rearview mirror. He passed frozen lakes and sleepy diners, roadside gas stations with flickering neon signs. But with every mile, the noise in his head, the doubts, the hesitations, the what-ifs, got quieter. He wasn't just a mechanic with dirt under his nails and bills to pay. He was a man who'd met someone who saw past all that, and he was done pretending that didn't matter. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, Jonah turned off the main highway and onto a winding back road, the tires crunching over gravel. A small hand-painted sign read, Langford Lake. Just ahead, nestled between the pines, was a cabin, modest, weathered. Smoke rising gently from its stone chimney, warm light glowed from the windows, golden against the blue dusk. He parked the truck at the edge of the narrow drive and stepped out, breath curling in the cold air. For a moment he just stood there, heart pounding like he'd run the whole way. This wasn't a repair job. It wasn't a business deal. It wasn't something he could walk away from if it got too hard. This was a choice. He walked up the snowy path to the front door, boots crunching steadily beneath him, and raised his hand to knock, not as a man chasing what was lost, but as one finally ready to be found. The door creaked open before he could knock. Ava stood there barefoot on the wood floor, a thick knit sweater draped over her shoulders and a mug cradled in her hands. Her hair was loose this time, falling in soft waves that brushed her collarbone, and her eyes, tired but steady, met his with something like surprise and something deeper still. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. The cold swirled around them like it was waiting for permission to pass. "I didn't think you'd come," she said finally, voice barely louder than the wind, whispering off the lake behind her. Jonah took a breath, his heart thudding hard in his chest. "Neither did I." She stepped back to let him in, and he crossed the threshold into warmth. The cabin smelled of pine and old cedar, a fire crackling softly in the stone hearth, simple furniture, handmade blankets, stacks of books scattered in uneven piles, no glass, no gloss, no corporate veneer, just Ava. "Nice place," Jonah said, scanning the room. "It was my mother's," she replied. "She came here when she needed to feel like herself again." She hesitated. I'm just starting to learn what that even means." Jonah glanced around. No cell service, no screens, just her voice, the fire, and a view of the frozen lake beyond the wide back windows. "So what's it been? Campfire therapy?" "Something like that," she said with a soft smile. "I've been undoing things. Years of noise, expectations, scripts I didn't write but kept performing anyway." He nodded, taking it in. "And now?" "I'm not sure," she said honestly, "but for the first time, I don't feel like I have to pretend I know." Jonah stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. "You walked away from everything." "I had to," she said. "I couldn't keep building a life I didn't believe in, not after meeting someone who reminded me what honesty looks like." His chest tightened at that. "I didn't come here to fix anything," he said. "I came because I couldn't keep pretending I didn't care. About you. About what we had. About what it could be." Ava's eyes shone, not with tears, but with something warmer. "I'm not a CEO here," she said, voice quiet. "I'm just Ava." Jonah reached out, brushing a hand against hers. "Good," he said, "because I didn't come here for Langford. I came for you." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long golden shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, the lake was a mirror of ice and moonlight, still and silent. Jonah and Ava sat near the fireplace, knees brushing as they shared a blanket, more out of instinct than design, the air between them thick with words that hadn't yet found their voice. Jonah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, cold, and familiar. He held it out to her, her key, the one she had hidden in the jacket weeks ago, tucked away with a note and a challenge that had turned into something bigger than either of them could have predicted. "I think this belongs to you," he said quietly. Ava looked down at the gleaming silver in his palm. Her breath caught just for a moment as she reached out and took it. Her fingers lingered against his. "I wasn't sure you'd ever use it," she said. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "But now I get it. You weren't just giving me a place to go. You were giving me the choice to come." She nodded slowly, tracing the edge of the key with her thumb. Jonah hesitated, then pulled something else from his pocket, a smaller key, older, brass and worn at the edges. He set it gently beside hers. She glanced up, eyes searching his. "What's this?" "It's the key to the old farmhouse on Maplewood Hill," he said. "I put in an offer. Needs work, but the bones are good, plenty of space, a porch that overlooks the trees." Her brows lifted. "You bought a house?" "Not just a house," Jonah said, voice soft. "A future, one that's mine, but maybe also yours, if you want it." The room went still, the fire popping softly behind them. "I'm not asking for a yes right now," he added. "Just wanted you to know I'm not walking away this time. I'm building something, and I want to build it with you." Ava stared at the key for a long, quiet moment. Then she reached over, laced her fingers with his, and whispered, "Then let's start with the front door." The first time Jonah pulled the truck back into Brook Hollow, with Ava in the passenger seat, it felt different, like crossing a familiar line with new eyes. The town hadn't changed. The same rusted stop signs, the leaning mailbox by the bakery, the cracked sidewalk outside the diner. But something in the air felt lighter. Maybe it was because she was next to him. They didn't make a show of it. No announcements, no grand re-entrance, just two people returning home, not as billionaire and mechanic, but as something steadier, something real. Partners. Jonah pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse on Maplewood Hill, the place he'd only ever dreamed of affording, now theirs. It still needed work. The porch railing was crooked, the roof wore age like a badge, and the paint had long since peeled away. But the foundation was strong, and the view of the town below stretched wide, like a promise. Ava stepped out of the truck and took it all in with a quiet smile. She wore a flannel borrowed from Jonah's closet, sleeves rolled, hair loose, boots scuffed. There wasn't a trace of the corporate sheen she used to wear like armor. This was the version of her he'd come to love. The one who didn't need glass towers or nameplates to feel powerful. They spent that first week repainting walls, patching windows, and planning what would go where. She handled measurements and layouts with the same focus she'd once used in boardrooms. He handled the hammer and the wiring, making things sturdy, grounding them both. They laughed when they argued over paint swatches, shared long silences over coffee at sunrise, and fell asleep with sawdust in their hair and the kind of peace that couldn't be bought. Word got around, of course. It always did. But the town surprised them. No gossip, just quiet nods. People came by to offer tools, advice, sometimes just a story about Jonah's dad. Mason even brought over a box of mismatched doorknobs, in case you want to make it weird and sentimental. And Ava she fit. Not because she changed, but because she chose to stay, not above the town, with it, with him. Brook Hollow had always been Jonah's world. Now it was theirs. Spring arrived slow and quiet in Brook Hollow, peeling back the frost with gentle sun and warm rain. The snow gave way to soft earth, and the fields around the farmhouse began to blush green again. Birds returned to the fence posts, and life resumed its rhythm, not rushed, not loud, just right. The farmhouse had changed, and so had they. The front porch had new railings, painted white. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon most mornings. Ava planted herbs in the windowsill, always forgetting which ones she'd watered. Jonah built a swing out back, overlooking the trees. Some nights they sat there in silence, hands intertwined, watching the fireflies drift like lazy sparks in the dusk. But it was the garage that became the heart of everything. Hale's Auto and Tire reopened 2 months later, cleaned up, reinforced, with a fresh coat of paint and a new sign that read, Hale and Langford Motors. It wasn't just Jonah's name on the door anymore, and not because she bought her way in, because she showed up every day, side by side, boots on the floor, sleeves rolled, elbow deep in engine grease when it called for it. They fixed cars together, old and new, practical and rare. And just beside the main shop, in a converted barn with polished floors and glass walls, they opened the Langford Auto Museum. Ava's collection lived there now, not behind velvet ropes, but among stories and handwritten notes about each vehicle's history. Kids came to visit on weekends, eyes wide. Locals who once thought those cars belonged in another world now walked through them like old friends. Mason handled tours on Saturdays, cracking jokes and pretending to hate it. Jonah's high school shop teacher donated a rusted-out '72 Chevy as a conversation piece. Ava just smiled through it all, more at peace than Jonah had ever seen her. It wasn't perfect. There were still bills to pay, nights when the roof leaked, parts that arrived late. But there was laughter in the mess, comfort in the noise, and love in everything. They didn't just build a home. They built a life, not out of wealth, out of choice, out of grace, out of the quiet decision every day to keep showing up for each other and for the place that held them. Home wasn't a key or a deed. It was them, at last.